Wild West love stories. Tales of passion, written on the American frontier.
The air inside the Red Hollow Saloon was a suffocating blanket woven from stale whiskey, sweat, and the quiet desperation of forgotten men. It was a place where futures came to die, drowned in cheap liquor and the haze of cigar smoke that clung to the grimy rafters like lost souls. But on this night, a different energy pierced the gloom, a current of raw, defiant life that forced every drunkard and gambler to lift their heavy heads. She was dragged into the lantern's weak glow, a young woman named Eliza Vance, with her hands bound but her spirit utterly free. Her eyes, burning with a storm of fury and untamed pride, swept across the leering faces, not with fear, but with a challenge that silenced their jeers. They saw a wildcat to be broken, a thing to be bought and sold. But from a shadowed corner, Caleb Blackwood, a rancher chained to a crippled leg and a past scorched by fire, saw something else entirely. He saw the reflection of his own stubborn refusal to shatter, the same untamable flame he thought had been extinguished within him long ago. In that charged silence, as a pouch of silver coins was tossed onto a filthy table, a gamble was made that would echo across the unforgiving plains. It was more than a transaction. It was an acknowledgement, a silent pact between two broken souls who refused to be swept away by the dust. What happens when a man who believes his life is over bets his last dollar on a woman the world has labeled worthless? The answer lies not in taming a wild heart, but in finding the courage to ride into the storm beside it. Stay with us at Wild West Love Stories to witness their journey, and if you believe in a love forged in fire and grit, be sure to like, share, and subscribe for more tales that honor the untamable spirit of the West. Part 1. The Fire's Shadow. The journey from the suffocating confines of Red Hollow to the Blackwood Ranch was an odyssey through silence. For what felt like an eternity, the only sounds were the rhythmic protest of the wagon's axles and the soft, percussive beat of the horses' hooves on the hard-packed trail, a lonely drumbeat measuring their passage into an even lonelier wilderness. Eliza Vance sat bolt upright on the unforgiving wooden seat, her posture a rigid wall against the weariness that threatened to claim her. Her hands, the skin around her wrists still an angry red, lay still in her lap, a conscious decision to appear calm, to betray nothing of the storm raging within her. To look at the man beside her, this Caleb Blackwood, would be an admission of a connection she wasn't ready to make. Connection was a vulnerability, a debt, and Eliza had learned the hard way that debts in this land were always collected, often with cruel interest. So she fixed her eyes forward, watching the vast, indifferent plains unfold. The setting sun had shattered across the horizon, spilling molten gold and bruised violet across a sky so immense it made her feel both infinitesimally small and, for a fleeting moment, unbound. This was the paradox of the West, a landscape that offered the dream of absolute freedom while constantly reminding you of your own fragile mortality. Caleb Blackwood, for his part, seemed a man carved from the very silence that surrounded them. He handled the reins with an economy of motion, his gaze steady on the trail ahead. He didn't speak, didn't offer the empty reassurances or probing questions she had expected. His quiet was a physical presence, a weight in the air, but it was not oppressive. It was a shared solitude, a stark contrast to the leering, noisy world of the saloon, and for that small, unexpected mercy, Eliza found a sliver of gratitude. As the last vestiges of light bled from the sky, a structure clawed its way into view, a dark silhouette against the deepening twilight. It did not rise with pride, but rather clung to the earth as if in defiance of the wind's constant efforts to tear it down. This was the Blackwood Ranch. The closer they got, the more the flickering lantern light seemed to conspire with the shadows, revealing a story of decay and resilience. The main house, a 2-story clapboard, was immediately striking for its disfigurement. An entire section of its western wall was a scar of new, pale lumber against the weathered, silver gray of the original structure, a testament to some past violence. But it was the barn that held the true horror. Half of it stood, sagging and weary, while the other half was a skeletal ruin of blackened timbers, pointing like accusing fingers at the star-dusted sky. The very air tasted of ash and memory. This was not merely a place of hardship, it was a battlefield, and the war was far from over. Caleb reined the horse to a halt, the sudden silence deafening. He dismounted with a slow, practiced movement, the scrape of his boot followed by the solid thud of his oak cane hitting the ground. He turned, his hand outstretched in an automatic gesture of courtesy. Eliza ignored it. She swung herself down, her boots landing in the dust with a soft puff, a silent declaration that she needed no help. From the deep shadows of the porch, a figure detached itself, coalescing into the form of a man as gnarled and resilient as an old mesquite tree. His face was a roadmap of hard years, his pale, watery eyes narrowing as they subjected Eliza to a clinical, dismissive appraisal that took in her tangled hair, her torn dress, and the blood dried at the corner of her mouth. This was not a welcome. "Cal." The old man's voice was like rocks grinding together. "What fresh hell did you drag home this time?" Caleb moved to unhitch the weary horse, his broad back turned to both of them. "This is Eliza Vance, Sly," he stated, his tone devoid of emotion. "She's stayin'." Silas Sly O'Malley worked his jaw for a moment before spitting a dark stream of tobacco juice into the dirt, the glob landing perilously close to Eliza's boot. It was a deliberate act of territorial pissing, a gesture she understood perfectly. "Stayin' on as what?" Sly challenged, his gaze still locked on her. "Another plate to fill?" "Winter's bitin' at our heels, in case you ain't noticed. She look like she can handle a branding iron or just break a man's spirit." The hostility was a familiar language, and Eliza was fluent. She held his gaze, her chin held high, her silence a more potent weapon than any curse he could level at her. Finally, Caleb turned, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "She'll work. And she'll earn her keep. Now, get a fire goin'." The nights got a chill. The curt command ended the standoff. Sly grunted, shot one last venomous look at Eliza, and disappeared into the house. The wounded king had spoken, and the old guard, however reluctantly, had obeyed. Caleb led her inside. The house was a reflection of its owner, stripped down to the bare essentials, functional, and carrying the scent of a deep, abiding sorrow. Cedar, old leather, and the ever-present phantom of wood smoke. A rough-hewn table and 2 chairs were the room's primary furniture, overshadowed by a massive stone hearth that looked like the only thing that could have survived the fire. With a nod, Caleb indicated a ladder leading to the upper level. "Loft's yours. Bedding's up there." And with that, he turned away, the conversation over. He had brought her into his world, but he was not yet inviting her into his life. Eliza ascended the ladder, her steps making no sound. The loft was small, the air thick with the smell of dried herbs hanging from the rafters. But the mattress was filled with fresh straw, The wool blanket was heavy and clean, and through a small, grimy window, the indifferent stars glittered. She did not undress. She lay atop the blanket, listening, absorbing the symphony of her new prison, or perhaps her new sanctuary. The wind howled a mournful tune as it scraped against the fire-scarred timbers of the barn. Below, the floorboards groaned under Caleb's uneven steps, the rhythmic tap-thud of his cane a constant reminder of his wound. From a small room off the main one, Sly's snores began, a rough, sawing sound that seemed to cut through the quiet. These were the sounds of men entombed in their own solitude. Eliza thought of the silver coins clinking on the saloon table. Why? Other men had wanted her for her body, for sport, for a target of their cruelty. This man had simply looked at her, and in his eyes, she had seen not desire, but a flicker of something she couldn't name. Recognition, perhaps. He was as scarred as his ranch, as broken as she felt. Lying there in the darkness, she felt the first stirrings of a dangerous emotion. Curiosity. What fire had done this? What man had he been before he needed that cane? For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she wasn't just thinking about the next meal or the next blow. She was thinking about the story of this place. And as the night wore on, a quiet resolve settled over her. She would not be a ghost in this house of ghosts. She would work until her hands bled. She would learn the rhythms of this broken land, and she would force these two silent, wounded men to see her not as a purchase, but as a force of nature in her own right. She would survive, as she always had. But perhaps, just perhaps, on this ridge of lost souls, she might finally find a piece of ground worth fighting for. Part 2. The Soil of Trust. Sevens. Dawn broke not with a gentle blush, but as a sharp, silver blade across the eastern plains, slicing through the lingering darkness. Long before it touched the splintered wood of the ranch house, Eliza Vance was already moving. Sleep had been a shallow, restless sea, and she emerged from it not rested, but ready. She moved with a quiet, purposeful grace, her bare feet making no sound on the cold floorboards of the loft. Below, the house was still, breathing in the slow, heavy rhythm of its sleeping occupants. She did not need to be told what to do. The language of work was universal, the only tongue she had ever been able to trust. The water pump outside groaned in protest as she worked the handle, the shriek of metal on metal, a jarring cry in the morning stillness, but the sound of the clear, cold water splashing into the bucket was a kind of music. She filled the kettle, stoked the embers in the hearth back to life, and added fresh wood until a cheerful, crackling fire began to push back the chill. It was as she was sweeping the porch, her movements methodical and efficient, that Sly O'Malley emerged from his room. He stood there for a long moment, a silhouette in the doorway, watching her with those pale, assessing eyes. He had expected to find her asleep, a lazy, worthless purchase his misguided boss would soon regret. Instead, he saw a woman already owning the morning, her brow furrowed in concentration as she cleared away the dust and debris of the previous day. He grunted, a sound that was neither approval nor disapproval, and shuffled past her to spit a stream of tobacco juice into the yard. Eliza didn't acknowledge him. She had learned long ago that the best way to deal with men like Sly was to make herself indispensable, to become a part of the landscape so thoroughly that they would forget they had ever questioned her right to be there. Later that morning, after a breakfast of stale bread and black coffee consumed in near total silence, Caleb limped toward the barn, his cane thudding a somber rhythm. Eliza followed at a respectful distance. The barn, or what was left of it, was a microcosm of the entire ranch, a place of functionality shadowed by profound loss. Tools were hung neatly on the walls that remained, but the air was thick with the scent of charred wood, a smell that soap and thyme had failed to wash away. While Caleb tended to the horse, Eliza's eyes scanned the space, cataloging its deficiencies. Her gaze fell upon a heap of leather in the corner, a broken harness, its main strap torn almost completely through. Sly had tossed it there weeks ago, deeming it unsalvageable. Without a word, Eliza picked it up, found an awl and a waxed thread in the tool chest, and sat on an overturned bucket. Her fingers, though slender, moved with a surprising strength and dexterity, a muscle memory born of years of mending things that others had deemed broken. Sly watched from the doorway, his face a mask of cynicism, expecting her to make a mess of it. But as the minutes stretched on, and a neat, strong line of stitches began to close the tear, his expression shifted. The hard set of his jaw softened almost imperceptibly. He had seen seasoned ranch hands struggle with that kind of repair. When she finished, she tested the seam, pulling it with all her might. It held. She didn't look to him for praise. She simply hung the restored harness on its proper hook and moved on to the next task. The soil of trust was hard and rocky, but she had just planted the first, stubborn seed. A few days later, the larder had dwindled to almost nothing. A trip to the town of Redemption was unavoidable. The name was a cruel joke, Eliza thought, as most of the people she'd met in these dusty outposts were far beyond it. The journey was, once again, a silent one, but the quality of the silence had changed. It was no longer the tense, wary silence of strangers. It was a comfortable, shared space, punctuated by the sights and sounds of the prairie. Redemption was a single dusty street lined with false-fronted buildings, a place teeming with the kind of life Eliza had grown to despise. Prying eyes, whispering mouths, and the swift, brutal judgment of small-minded people. As Caleb guided the wagon to a stop in front of McGregor's general store, Eliza felt a familiar tightening in her gut. She was an anomaly, a woman without a husband or a father, sitting beside the town's resident recluse. She was a story, and stories in a town like this were currency, often traded for reputation and blood. Inside, the store smelled of pickles, sawdust, and bolt cloth. As Caleb began his transaction with the stout, balding Mr. McGregor, a tinkling bell announced another customer. A young woman entered, her dress a cascade of blue gingham that seemed impossibly clean in the dusty town. Her blonde hair was perfectly coiffed, and she moved with the easy, entitled grace of someone who had never known a day of hardship. This was Sarah McGregor, the town jewel and, as Eliza would quickly learn, the self-proclaimed intended of Caleb Blackwood. "Caleb, I heard you were in town." Sarah's voice was sweet as honey, but her eyes, as they swept over Eliza, were as sharp and cold as chips of ice. She ignored Eliza completely, positioning herself between her and Caleb, a proprietary hand landing on his arm. "Daddy said your supplies were running low. You know you only have to ask, and we'd be happy to extend you more credit." Caleb shifted uncomfortably, gently removing his arm from her grasp. "Appreciate the offer, Sarah, but we're fine." Sarah's smile didn't falter, but her eyes narrowed. "We? I didn't know you'd hired new help." She finally deigned to look at Eliza, her gaze lingering on Eliza's worn dress and the calluses on her hands. It's so hard to find good help these days, especially the quiet kind. The insult was clear, labeling Eliza as little more than a beast of burden or a hired mute. The old Eliza, the one from the saloon, would have met this venom with a lash of her tongue. But the Eliza of the Blackwood ranch was learning a different kind of strength. She simply met Sarah's gaze, her expression calm and unreadable, and said nothing. Her silence was more unnerving to Sarah than any retort could have been. "This is Eliza Vance." Caleb's voice cut through the tension, low and firm. He didn't elaborate, didn't explain, didn't justify. He just stated her name, a simple act that conferred upon her an identity, a legitimacy, that no one had ever bothered to give her before. He then nodded to Mr. McGregor. "We'll take these things now." The dismissal was unmistakable. Sarah's face flushed a blotchy red. She had been publicly rebuffed, and in front of this, nobody. She shot Eliza a look of pure loathing before turning on her heel and flouncing out of the store. The journey back to the ranch began in that same familiar silence, but now it was charged with unspoken meaning. Eliza stared at her hands, turning Caleb's words over in her mind. This is Eliza Vance. He had not called her the girl or my help. He had given her back her name. As they neared the ranch, Caleb finally spoke, his eyes on the trail. "Sarah. She means well." It was a clumsy attempt at an apology for his neighbor's behavior, and they both knew it. Eliza just nodded. "Some folks mistake being loud for being important," she said softly. He glanced at her, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. He hadn't expected her to understand. Before they reached the house, he pulled a small parcel from one of the sacks. It was a pair of sturdy, soft leather work gloves. "Figured these might be of use," he mumbled, handing them to her without meeting her eyes. "The ones in the barn are all too big." It was not a gift of sentiment. It was a gift of practical necessity, an acknowledgement of the work she did, of the value she brought. It was better than 1,000 flowery compliments. Eliza took them, the leather warm from the sun. "Thank you," she whispered, and for the first time, the words felt true. In the days that followed, a new rhythm settled over the ranch. It was a rhythm of shared work, of quiet understanding. Eliza would leave a cup of hot coffee on the porch rail for Caleb every morning, and he would leave a freshly sharpened axe by the woodpile for her. Sly still grumbled and complained, but his insults lost their bite, and one afternoon, Eliza saw him watching her break a stubborn colt with a look that bordered on admiration. The ranch was still a place of ghosts, but for the first time, it felt as though new life was taking root. The nights remained the hardest. The wind still moaned its lonely song, and the silence of the house could be oppressive. But one night, a new sound shattered the quiet. It started as a low moan from Caleb's room below, a sound of such profound agony it made Eliza's heart clench. Then came the words, choked and frantic, torn from the depths of a nightmare. "The smoke. Can't see. Papa. The beam. Get out. Fire." The last word was a strangled cry, a sound of pure terror that seemed to shake the very foundations of the house. Eliza crept from her bed and down the ladder, her heart pounding. The door to Caleb's room was slightly ajar. Peeking through the crack, she could see him in his bed, thrashing against unseen demons, his face slick with sweat in the moonlight, his hands clenched into fists as if trying to fight off the flames of memory. She stood there, frozen, one hand on the rough wood of the ladder, a silent witness to his torment. She saw not the stoic, capable rancher, but a man trapped in the embers of a private hell. All the pieces clicked into place. The scars on the ranch, the wound in his leg, the profound sadness in his eyes. She finally understood that the fire that had scarred this land was still burning, deep inside the man who owned it. She did not go to him, did not offer comfort. It was not her place. But as she retreated back to the shadows of her loft, the last of the walls around her own heart began to crumble. The soil of trust, watered by shared work and quiet respect, had finally been broken by a glimpse into a shared pain. And she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her soul, that her fight was no longer just for her own survival, but for his as well. Part 3. The Devil's Signature. Sevens. The fragile peace that had settled over the Blackwood ranch was shattered by the arrival of a man who moved as if the dust of the West dared not cling to his polished boots. He rode a handsome bay gelding with a silver inlaid saddle, and his suit, a funereal gray, was impeccably tailored, a stark and unwelcome intrusion of city artifice into their world of raw survival. He dismounted not with the easy grace of a horseman, but with the precise, deliberate motions of a man who owned the ground he stood on, whether he had a deed to it or not. Eliza watched him from the barn, a cold knot tightening in her stomach. She had seen his type before. Predators who hunted not with guns, but with ink and paper, their smiles sharper than any blade. Caleb and Sly met him on the porch, Caleb leaning on his cane, his face a stony mask, Sly standing slightly behind him, radiating an aura of pure, undiluted animosity. The man tipped his bowler hat, a gesture of mock civility that didn't reach his cold, reptilian eyes. "Caleb Blackwood?" he inquired, his voice smooth as oiled machinery. "My name is Silas Croft. I'm an agent with the Wyoming Land and Title Bank, out of Cheyenne. Just performing a routine verification of holdings in this valley." Croft's smile widened, showing teeth that were a little too white, a little too perfect. He exuded an air of unshakable confidence that set every nerve in Eliza's body on edge. From his leather satchel, he produced a folded document, handling it with the reverence of a priest handling a holy text. "Our records show a small discrepancy regarding your deed, Mr. Blackwood. A minor clerical error, I'm sure, but one that requires your signature on this updated survey to rectify. Bank policy, you understand." Caleb, a man of the land who trusted soil and seasons far more than fine print, took the document. His brow furrowed as he stared at the dense block of text, the legal jargon, a foreign language designed to confuse and ensnare. Eliza saw the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, the weariness of a man already carrying too many burdens to fight a war on a battlefield of words. Sly squinted at the paper. "I don't like it. Cal. Smells fouler than a week-old coyote carcass." Croft chuckled, a dry, rustling sound. "I assure you, it's standard procedure. Just a formality to ensure your title is clear for the bank's records. A simple signature at the bottom is all that's required." He produced a fancy fountain pen, its gold nib glinting in the harsh sunlight. It was in that moment, as Caleb's hand hesitated over the paper, that Eliza moved. She walked from the barn, wiping her hands on a piece of burlap, her steps even and deliberate. She stopped beside Caleb, her presence a silent interruption. "May I?" she asked, her voice quiet but firm, her eyes fixed not on Caleb, but on Silas Croft. Croft's smile tightened at the edges. "This is private bank business, miss. Hardly the concern of the help." The condescension dripped from his words. Eliza ignored him, her gaze unwavering on Caleb. After a long moment, he passed her the document. Her fingers, calloused and strong, felt the unnatural crispness of the paper, the smell of the ink too fresh, too new. She began to read. Her lips moved slightly, her eyes scanning the lines with a ferocious concentration that made Croft visibly uncomfortable. Years spent in the back offices of cruel masters, forced to read ledgers and contracts far beyond her station, had given her an unlikely education. She had learned the architecture of a lie, the way a trap was built with clauses and subsections. And this document was a masterpiece of deceit. Her eyes narrowed. "This letterhead," she said, her voice cutting through the silence. "The Wyoming Land and Title Bank changed their logo 3 years ago. My last employer lost his ranch to them. I remember the new papers well." Croft's composure cracked for a fraction of a second. "A minor oversight. We're simply using up old stock." Eliza didn't look up from the page. "And this clause," she continued, her finger tracing a particularly dense paragraph. "Article 7, Section B. This isn't a survey rectification. It's a voluntary forfeiture trigger. It states that by signing, the landowner acknowledges a pre-existing, unsecured debt to the bank, and should that debt not be repaid within 60 days, the property is transferred to the bank in lieu of payment." She finally lifted her head, her eyes locking onto Croft's. "What debt does Mr. Blackwood have with your bank that he doesn't know about, Mr. Croft?" The game was over. Croft's face, which had been a mask of slick confidence, contorted into a snarl of pure fury. Sly let out a low whistle of admiration. Caleb stared at Eliza, a look of stunned disbelief and dawning comprehension on his face. He had been moments away from signing away his birthright, his father's legacy, everything he had fought to hold on to. "You're a clever little thing, aren't you?" Croft spat, snatching the paper from her hand. "Too clever for your own good." Eliza folded her arms. "And you're not clever enough. I've seen your kind float through this country like vultures, picking the bones of good people who can't read the fine print. You find a man who's been struck by tragedy, a man you think is weak, and you move in for the kill. Not this time. Not this ranch." Her voice rang with an authority that stunned them all. "You can take your devil's signature," she finished, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl, "and ride back to whatever snake pit you crawled out of. And you tell your boss, Bartholomew Thorne, that the Blackwood Ranch is not for sale." At the mention of Thorne's name, both Croft and Caleb flinched. Croft's face went pale. He hadn't said who he worked for, but Eliza had made the connection, a gambler's leap of logic based on whispers and rumors she'd heard about the powerful man buying up the entire valley. Croft, exposed and defeated, stuffed the document into his satchel. "This isn't over," he hissed, his voice trembling with rage. "Thorne gets what he wants. Always." He mounted his horse and galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust and impotent fury in his wake. Silence descended upon the porch, thick and heavy. Sly broke it by letting out a hearty laugh, slapping his knee. "Well, I'll be damned. The little wildcat's got the claws of a grizzly and the mind of a Philadelphia lawyer." But Caleb wasn't laughing. He was looking at Eliza, truly looking at her, perhaps for the first time. He saw not the wild thing from the saloon, not the quiet worker, but the woman who had just stood between him and utter ruin. He had paid a handful of silver for her freedom, and she had just repaid him by saving his entire world. That evening, the atmosphere in the small house had transformed. The unspoken walls between them had been leveled. They sat at the rough-hewn table, a single lantern casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. Sly, for his part, had quietly placed a plate with an extra biscuit in front of Eliza at dinner, an act of surrender and respect more eloquent than any words. After Sly had retired to his room, Caleb and Eliza sat in a comfortable silence, the fire crackling in the hearth. It was Caleb who finally broke it, his voice rough with an emotion she couldn't decipher. "How did you know?" She shrugged, staring into the flames. "When you've got nothing, you learn to pay attention to everything. You learn to read the things that aren't written on the page. I saw a trap because I've spent my whole life either being in one or running from one." He nodded slowly, his hands tracing the worn grain of the tabletop. "My father. He built this place from nothing. Said the land doesn't lie to you. People do." He looked up, and his eyes, for the first time, were completely unguarded, stripped of their stoic defense. He was finally ready to share the weight of his secret. The fire. It wasn't an accident. Eliza held her breath, her entire being focused on him. "It happened 5 years ago," he began, his voice barely a whisper. "Thorne's father and mine had been feuding over water rights for years. My father won the dispute in court, fair and square. The Thornes never forgive a slight. One night, I was careless. I was working late in the new barn we'd just built, checking on a sick calf. I kicked over a lantern. I thought I'd put it out, but by the time I woke up, the whole north side of the ranch was an inferno." His voice broke, and he looked down at his hands. "My father ran back in, trying to save the horses. A burning beam fell. It trapped him. I tried to get to him, but another one came down. It crushed my leg. And I watched him die. I watched him burn because I was too weak, too careless. A single tear traced a path through the grime on his cheek. I killed him, Eliza. I burned down half of what he built, and I killed him." He finally looked at her, his face a mask of agony, expecting to see disgust, pity, accusation. But Eliza's eyes held none of those things. They held a deep, profound understanding, the empathy of a fellow survivor. She reached across the table, her calloused fingers gently covering his clenched fist. "You didn't kill him," she said, her voice soft but absolute. "A kicked-over lantern doesn't burn down a barn and a house in minutes. Not like that. An accident doesn't hunt you down. Thorne's vengeance did that. You were just the one left behind to carry the blame." Her words were a revelation, a key turning in a lock that had been rusted shut for 5 years. The possibility that he was not a failure, but a victim, was a concept so foreign he could barely grasp it. In that moment, the dynamic between them shifted irrevocably. She was no longer the girl he had bought, and he was no longer the man who employed her. They were partners, 2 survivors, bound by shared trauma and a common enemy. The midpoint had been reached. The passive defense of their lives was over. From this moment on, they would fight back. Together. Part 4. Rattlesnakes and Rumors. Sevens. The departure of Silas Croft did not bring peace to the Blackwood Ranch. It merely replaced a single, visible threat with 100 invisible ones. Bartholomew Thorne was not a man who accepted defeat, and his retaliation was as insidious and persistent as a slow-acting poison. It began not with a bang, but with a series of small, unnerving incidents designed to bleed them dry, to unravel their sanity stitch by stitch. The first sign was the water. The creek that flowed down from the northern hills, the lifeblood of the ranch, began to run murky, tainted with a foul, oily sheen. The cattle refused to drink, their lowing a constant, mournful complaint that echoed across the valley. Caleb and Eliza spent 2 grueling days riding the entire length of the creek until they found the source. The bloated, decomposing carcass of a dead bull, deliberately dragged into a narrow choke point to contaminate the entire downstream supply. It took them the rest of the day to haul the rotting animal out, the stench clinging to them for days after, a constant, nauseating reminder of their enemy's character. Then came the fences. Sections of barbed wire, miles from the house, were systematically cut in the dead of night, allowing small groups of cattle to wander off into the rugged, unforgiving Badlands. Their days became a grueling routine of mending fences, and their nights were spent on exhausting, often fruitless searches for the lost livestock. These were not the actions of a common rustler who would take the whole herd. This was the work of a phantom, a saboteur whose only goal was to inflict maximum pain with minimum effort, to make them feel helpless and besieged on their own land. Thorne was waging a war of attrition, a campaign of 1,000 cuts, and the ranch, already weakened, was beginning to bleed. In the town of Redemption, a different kind of poison was being spread. Sarah McGregor, her pride wounded and her dreams of becoming Mrs. Blackwood shattered, had become an unwitting pawn in Thorne's game. Her bitterness made her susceptible to the well-placed whispers of Thorne's associates. She began to sow rumors, her words weaving a tapestry of lies that isolated the Blackwood Ranch even further. She spoke of the strange, wild woman Caleb had bought, hinting at a dark past and a dangerous nature. She painted Caleb as a fool, bewitched by a grifter who was likely after what little he had left. The town, always hungry for scandal, devoured her stories. Old friends of Caleb began to look away when he rode down the street. Mr. McGregor's credit, once a lifeline, suddenly tightened. They were being turned into pariahs, an island of outcasts in a sea of suspicion. During one tense supply run, the weight of the town's hostility became unbearable. As Eliza was loading sacks of flour onto the wagon, Sarah approached, her face a mask of false sympathy. "You know," she said, her voice loud enough for the onlookers to hear, "Mr. Thorne has been making very generous offers to ranchers in this valley. A chance for a fresh start, away from all this tragedy." The implication was clear. Sell out, give up. Eliza loaded the last sack before turning to face her. "Some people see a fresh start as a chance to run, Miss McGregor," Eliza said, her voice low and steady. "Others see it as a reason to stand their ground and fight." The confrontation solidified their isolation, but it also forged the bond between Caleb and Eliza into something harder than steel. The shared hardship stripped away any remaining pretense. They were no longer just a rancher and his hired hand. They were soldiers in the same trench, fighting back to back against a relentless enemy. The passive defense was no longer enough. The night they returned from that hostile trip to town, the three of them, Caleb, Eliza, and a grim-faced Sly, sat around the kitchen table. The meager fire in the hearth seemed to huddle in on itself, a small pocket of warmth against a world grown cold. "He's trying to choke us out," Sly rasped, his usual cynicism replaced by a cold fury. "He won't stop till we're either broke or buried." Caleb stared into the fire, his jaw working. The guilt that had crippled him for 5 years had been replaced by a slow-burning rage. The knowledge that he had been a victim, not a failure, had uncaged something within him. "Then we stop defending," he said, his voice a low growl. "And we start hunting." It was Eliza who gave their new purpose a direction. "Thorne's a businessman," she reasoned, her mind piecing together the scattered clues. "Men like him don't go to this much trouble for a small, struggling ranch out of simple revenge. The risk is too high. This land has something he needs, something more valuable than water or grazing." Sly, using his network of old-timer cowboys and gossipy stable hands, began to listen more intently to the whispers on the wind. He spent days away, returning with fragmented pieces of a larger puzzle. He spoke of surveyors seen near the far end of the valley, of hushed conversations in Cheyenne about the transcontinental railroad looking for a new, easier route through the mountains. A railroad. The word hung in the air, electric with possibility. A depot, a station, a water stop, any one of them would turn this forgotten valley into a gold mine overnight. Suddenly, Thorne's desperate, systematic acquisition of land made perfect, terrifying sense. He wasn't just settling an old score, he was consolidating an empire before anyone else knew the throne was being built. Their fight shifted from survival to a race for the truth. They needed proof, something concrete to expose Thorne's scheme before he could complete it. Their investigation led them to the attic of the old house, a repository of dust and memories, searching for any of Caleb's father's old records. Amidst stacks of brittle newspapers and forgotten family heirlooms, Eliza found a small, locked metal box. Inside, beneath faded photographs and a pair of baby shoes, was a bundle of letters tied with a ribbon. They were from Caleb's father to his brother, an attorney in Laramie. As Caleb read them aloud, his voice thick with emotion, the full story of the feud came to light. His father had not just won a legal dispute, he had publicly exposed Thorne's father for a massive land fraud scheme that would have cheated dozens of smaller settlers out of their claims. He had saved the valley once before. One letter, dated just a week before the fire, was particularly chilling. "Bartholomew is back from the east," Caleb's father had written. "He has his father's greed, but none of his caution. He looks at this valley with a hunger I have not seen before. I fear he carries the sins of his father like a loaded gun, and he is looking for someone to pull the trigger on." There it was. Not proof of arson, but a clear testament to motive. Thorne's attack was not just business or revenge. It was an attempt to erase a legacy of honor that stood in stark contrast to his own family's history of shame. They now had a direction, a motive, and a ticking clock. Their plan was desperate, a long shot. They would ride to Laramie to find Caleb's uncle, the attorney. The letters were not enough to convict a man like Thorne, but perhaps his uncle would have more documentation, more evidence from the original fraud case that could expose a pattern of criminal behavior. It was a get-rich-or-die-trying moment, a final, desperate gambit to save their home. As they prepared for the long journey, a sense of grim purpose settled over them. The rattlesnakes had struck, the rumors had spread, but instead of breaking them, the poison had only made them stronger, more determined. They were no longer just defending the Blackwood ranch. They were fighting for the memory of a good man, for their future, and for the very soul of the valley. The fight had become personal, and they were ready to take it straight to the heart of the snake's den. Part 5. Fire and Lead. Sevens. The journey to Laramie was a tense, hurried affair, a race against a clock they could not see but could feel ticking in their bones. They rode hard, pushing their horses to the limit, the bundle of letters that represented their only hope wrapped carefully in oilcloth and tucked deep within Caleb's saddlebag. However, Bartholomew Thorne was not a man to be underestimated. His network of spies and informants stretched across the territory like a spider's web, and the unusual activity at the Blackwood ranch had not gone unnoticed. A nervous stable hand in redemption, bribed with a few of Thorne's silver dollars, had reported their departure, and the purpose of their journey was not hard to guess. Thorne knew the endgame was approaching. He could no longer rely on sabotage and rumors. The time for subtlety was over. He had to erase the Blackwood ranch, and everyone on it, from the map before they could bring the ghosts of the past back to haunt him. The storm that had been threatening for days finally broke on the night they returned from Laramie, a journey that had been both fruitful and frustrating. Caleb's uncle, a weary but honorable man, had corroborated their story and possessed documents detailing the Thorne family's history of corruption, but he warned them that a direct legal challenge against a man of Bartholomew's power would be a long, brutal fight. As they rode into the ranch, the sky overhead was a bruised, turbulent sea of black and purple clouds. Rain began to fall, not as a gentle shower, but as a hard, driving deluge that turned the dusty yard into a sea of mud. The wind howled like a vengeful spirit, tearing at the fire-scarred timbers of the barn. It was the perfect night for violence, a night when the world would be blind and deaf to whatever horrors unfolded in this isolated corner of the valley. They had just managed to get the horses into the relative safety of the barn when Sly, who had been watching the ridgeline with the sixth sense of a seasoned wolf, let out a sharp, low whistle. "Riders," he hissed, his voice barely audible above the roar of the wind. "At least half a dozen. And they ain't comin' for coffee." In an instant, the exhaustion from their journey vanished, replaced by a surge of pure, cold adrenaline. Thorne had come for them. This was the final siege. There was no time to run, nowhere to hide. They were trapped. "The house," Caleb commanded, his voice steady, the voice of a man who had finally found his purpose. "Barricade the windows. Sly, take the loft window. Eliza, the front. I'll take the back." They moved with a desperate, synchronized efficiency, their actions honed by weeks of working together. Heavy furniture was scraped across the floor to block the doors. Rifles were checked, and boxes of precious ammunition were placed strategically. Outside, the riders fanned out, their dark forms barely visible through the sheets of rain, circling the house like predators cornering their prey. A voice, amplified by the wind, boomed across the yard. It was Thorne. "Blackwood! You've been a thorn in my side for too long, just like your sanctimonious father. I gave you a chance to walk away. Now, I will burn your legacy to the ground and salt the earth where it stood." The first gunshot shattered the night, the bullet splintering the wooden frame of the front window, showering Eliza with fragments. The battle had begun. The house became a fortress under siege. Muzzle flashes lit up the storm-drenched darkness, followed by the deafening roar of rifles and the angry whine of ricocheting lead. Inside, the three defenders fought with a ferocity born of desperation. Sly, from his perch in the loft, was a master marksman, his shots carefully placed, forcing the attackers to keep their distance. Caleb, positioned at the back, fired with a cold, methodical anger, protecting their most vulnerable flank. And Eliza, stationed at the front, was a revelation. She loaded and fired her rifle with a calm, deadly precision, her eyes narrowed, her movements fluid and economical. She was not just a survivor, she was a warrior, forged in the fires of a lifetime of struggle. The air grew thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder and fear. For what felt like an eternity, they held their own, the thick walls of the old house providing just enough cover. But their enemies were numerous, and Thorn was growing impatient. "Burn it!" he roared, his voice thick with maniacal rage. Burn it all. Flaming torches, protected from the worst of the rain by oil-soaked rags, sailed through the air. One landed on the porch, another near the barn. The newer, drier wood of the porch caught quickly, flames beginning to lick at the side of the house, the smoke an all-too-familiar phantom. It was then that a small, unexpected act of redemption occurred. In redemption, Sarah McGregor, consumed by guilt over the rumors she had spread and terrified by the sight of Thorn and his men riding out of town armed for war, had made a choice. Overcoming her fear, she had ridden to the town's part-time sheriff, a man more interested in his bottle than his badge, and confessed everything. The sheriff, finally spurred to action, had gathered a small posse. They were still miles away, but help, however unlikely, was on its way. Back at the ranch, the fire was their greatest enemy. The smoke began to seep into the house, choking them, blinding them. "We have to break out," Caleb yelled over the din. "Make a run for the rocks behind the barn. It's our only chance." It was a suicidal plan, but staying put meant being burned alive. Under the cover of a volley of coordinated shots, they burst out of the back door, plunging into the chaos of the storm. They ran through the blinding rain and suffocating smoke, the demonic glow of the fire at their backs. As they reached the relative cover of the rock outcropping, one of Thorn's men managed to get a clear shot. Caleb cried out, a sharp intake of breath, and stumbled, clutching his shoulder. He was hit. Eliza and Sly dragged him behind a large boulder, the fight now seemingly lost. It was at this moment that Thorn, seeing Caleb fall, made his fatal mistake. Consumed by arrogance and the need to gloat, he strode forward from the shadows, his long coat whipping in the wind, a pistol in his hand. He kicked Caleb's rifle away and loomed over them, his face illuminated by the raging fire, a mask of triumphant hatred. "It ends here, Blackwood," he sneered, leveling his pistol at Caleb's head. "Just like it should have 5 years ago. Did you really think that lantern kicking over was an accident? I had my men douse that barn in kerosene. It was supposed to be a warning, but your father, he was always too heroic for his own good. Watching him burn was the most satisfying moment of my life." The confession hung in the air, a truth more devastating than any bullet. Caleb stared up at him, not with fear, but with a sudden, liberating clarity. The guilt, the shame, the weight that had crushed him for 5 years, was lifted in an instant, consumed by a pure, white-hot rage. He was not responsible. He was free. That freedom gave him strength. As Thorne savored his monologue, he failed to notice Eliza, who had been silently circling behind another rock. With a primal scream, she launched herself at him, a warrior fighting for her home, for the man who had shown her kindness. She slammed into him with the force of a battering ram, knocking his arm wide just as he pulled the trigger. The shot went wild, echoing into the night. The two of them wrestled in the mud and rain, a desperate struggle of grit against brute force. The distraction was all Caleb needed. Ignoring the searing pain in his shoulder, he lunged for Sly's discarded pistol. He rolled, came up on one knee, and fired. The shot was true. Thorne stiffened, a look of shocked disbelief on his face, before collapsing into the mud. The remaining attackers, their leader fallen, and the distant sound of approaching riders from the sheriff's posse reaching their ears, broke and fled into the darkness. As silence fell, broken only by the hiss of the rain on the fire and the ragged gasps of their own breathing, it was over. Caleb, Eliza, and Sly stood together amidst the ruins of their battlefield, wounded, exhausted, but victorious. The fire raged on, consuming the barn and scorching the side of the house, but it was a cleansing fire now. It was burning away the last of the ghosts, making way for a future they had earned with their own fire and lead. Part 6. Wildflower Ridge. Sevens. The dawn that followed the night of fire and lead broke clear and quiet, as if the storm had scoured the world clean. The air was crisp, washed by the rain, and carried the sharp, clean scent of wet pine and damp earth, mingled with the lingering, acrid smell of burnt timber. The Blackwood ranch was a scene of devastation, a study in black and gray. The barn was a skeletal ruin, its charred ribs stark against the pale morning sky. A significant portion of the house was scorched and blackened, the porch completely gone. But amidst the destruction, the main structure of the house still stood, defiant and resilient, much like the three souls who had defended it. They were wounded, bone-weary, but they were alive. The arrival of the sheriff's posse had been anticlimactic. The battle was already won. Thorne's body was unceremoniously hauled away. His remaining men who were captured would face justice, and the story of the siege at the Blackwood ranch would become a local legend. But for Caleb, Eliza, and Sly, the legend was a harsh reality they now had to live with. The weeks that followed were a blur of hard labor and quiet healing. Caleb's shoulder wound was painful, but it was a clean wound, a physical injury that was far easier to bear than the psychological scars he had carried for 5 years. The truth about the fire had been a cauterizing agent for his soul, burning away the guilt that had festered for so long. For the first time since his father's death, he walked his land not as a penitent, but as a protector, his limp less a sign of weakness and more a testament to his survival. Sly, miraculously unharmed save for a few scrapes, became the tireless engine of their reconstruction, his cantankerous energy now focused on a single, unwavering purpose: to rebuild. And Eliza, who had entered this place as a stranger with nothing, now moved with the undeniable authority of a woman defending her home. She was the heart of their recovery, her pragmatic optimism a balm against their weariness. She dressed Caleb's wound, organized their meager resources, and worked alongside the men from sunup to sundown, her hands as skilled at nailing new timbers as they were at tending a fire. The news from Laramie, brought by a rider from Caleb's uncle, arrived a month later, and it was the final turning of the tide. With Thorne dead and his criminal enterprise exposed, the railroad company, eager to avoid scandal, had officially announced its new route through the valley. More importantly, They confirmed they would be purchasing water rights at a fair price from all the local landowners. The Blackwood Ranch, with its steady creek, was suddenly not just viable, but valuable. The cloud of financial ruin that had perpetually hung over them had finally lifted, replaced by the bright, clear sky of a secure future. With the influx of funds, the rebuilding accelerated. Neighbors who had once shunned them, now free from Thorne's influence and shamed by Sarah McGregor's public apology, came to offer help. The town of Redemption began to live up to its name. The barn was rebuilt, stronger than before. The scorched walls of the house were replaced, and a new porch was constructed. But they did not try to erase the scars completely. A single, blackened beam from the original barn was salvaged by Caleb and placed above the hearth in the main room, a somber reminder of the price of their peace. Amidst the relentless work, the unspoken bond between Caleb and Eliza deepened, growing with a quiet, powerful certainty. It was in the way he would watch her from across the yard, a look of awe and profound affection in his eyes. It was in the way she would bring him a cup of water without him having to ask, her hand brushing his in a gesture that lingered longer than necessary. They had faced death together, and in doing so, had forged a connection that transcended words. There were no grand declarations, no flowery speeches. Their love story was written in shared sweat, common purpose, and the silent, unwavering support they offered each other every single day. One warm evening in late summer, as the sun began to dip below the newly rebuilt fence line, casting the entire valley in a soft, golden glow, Caleb found Eliza on the small, rocky hill that overlooked the southern pasture. It was a place she had claimed as her own, a barren patch of ground where she had, against all odds, managed to coax a small, tenacious garden of wildflowers into bloom. Forget-me-nots, daisies, and lavender grew in vibrant clusters, a defiant splash of color on the stony soil. She was kneeling, tending to the flowers, a smudge of dirt on her cheek. He stood there for a moment, just watching her, this incredible woman who had bloomed in the harshest of environments, just like the flowers she nurtured. "Sly told me once this hill was good for nothing but rattlesnakes," he said, his voice soft. Eliza looked up, shielding her eyes from the sun, a small smile playing on her lips. He was wrong. Everything has a purpose. Sometimes you just have to be patient enough to find it. Caleb walked closer and sat on a warm boulder beside her. He held something in his hand, a piece of wood he had been carving for weeks. It wasn't a ring. He knew a ring was not their style. It was a small, beautifully carved sign, made from the heartwood of an old oak that had survived the fire. "I was thinking," he began, his voice a little unsteady, "that a place is defined by the people who live in it. For 5 years, this was just the Blackwood Ranch. It was my father's name, my burden. It was a place of ghosts." He paused, looking out over the ranch, now whole and healed below them. "But it's not that place anymore. You came here, and you fought for it. You saw what it could be. You planted flowers on barren ground, Eliza. You made things grow here that I thought were dead forever." He turned to her, his eyes full of an emotion so raw and powerful it made her breath catch in her throat. "I don't want to live in a place of ghosts anymore. I want to live in a place that's alive. I want to live in your home, if you'll let it be mine too." He then showed her the sign he was holding. Carved into the wood in elegant, flowing letters were 2 words: Wildflower Ridge. Eliza stared at the sign, her throat tightening, her eyes stinging with tears she refused to let fall. It was more than a name. It was her story. It was their story. "You're not a thing to be tamed, Eliza Vance," he whispered, finally saying the words that had been in his heart since he first saw her in that saloon. "You're a thing to be marveled at. I don't want to own you. I don't want to keep you. I just want to stand beside you, for as long as you'll have me." She didn't answer with words. She simply reached out and took his hand, her calloused fingers lacing through his. It was a simple, profound act of acceptance. He had not asked her to be his wife in the traditional sense. He had asked her to be his partner, his equal, in every way that mattered. And her answer was in her touch, in the brilliant, shining light in her eyes that outshone the setting sun. They installed the new sign on the main gate the next day. The name Blackwood Ranch was taken down and respectfully stored in the rebuilt barn. As Wildflower Ridge was hoisted into place, it marked the true beginning of their new life. From that day forward, Eliza Vance and Caleb Blackwood rode the fences together, worked the land together, and built a future together, not as master and servant, not as buyer and bought, but as two halves of a whole, two wildflowers who had found their ridge and had, against all odds, bloomed. The story of Wildflower Ridge is more than just a tale of survival in a harsh and unforgiving land. It is a powerful testament to the extraordinary strength that blossoms when respect is valued over control. It is the story of Eliza Vance, a woman labeled too wild by a world that sought to break her, who proved that her spirit was not a thing to be tamed, but a force to be cherished. And it is the story of Caleb Blackwood, a man shackled by the ghosts of his past, who discovered that true healing comes not from forgetting, but from finding someone brave enough to face the fire with you. Their journey teaches us a profound lesson. Love, in its purest form, is not about possession. It is not about changing someone into who you think they should be. It is about seeing the untamed beauty in their soul and choosing to stand beside them, to be their partner against the storms, and to build a sanctuary together from the ashes of yesterday. Theirs is a love story written in grit and gunpowder, in silent understanding and shared struggle, a reminder that the strongest bonds are forged in the fiercest flames. If their story touched your heart, if you believe that even the most broken souls can find a place to bloom, then you have found a home here at Wild West Love Stories. We ask you to share this tale of resilience and redemption with someone you know, to like this video, and to subscribe to our channel. By doing so, you help us keep these timeless stories of courage and untamable love alive for all to hear. Thank you for riding along with us.